All right, today we're going to take a look at 7.2, the war expanding. We'll take a look at why and how Europeans helped the United States. We'll also take a look at some of the hardships and sacrifices that the revolutionary forces faced in the war effort. We'll talk about the war on the frontier, and then we'll talk about some important battles at sea. Right here is one of my favorite people in history. You guys know that is Benjamin Franklin. And we'll talk about him in a second. But to defeat the mighty British Empire, the United States needed a foreign ally. By definition, an ally is a country that agrees to help another country achieve a common goal. The ideal ally would share America's goals of defeating Britain. It also had to be able to provide money, troops, and ships. So the United States turned to France, Britain's longtime enemy. In the fall of 1776, Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to the French capital of Paris. While he was there, his job was to persuade France to be the ally of the United States. Franklin was already famous for his experiments with electricity, and when he reached Paris, he became a celebrity. He wrote to his daughter saying that medallions with his likeness were popular there. Now, in spite of his popularity, Franklin couldn't convince the French to become America's formal ally until after the victory at Saratoga. Then the French agreed to an alliance. So this section today explains how the war expanded after foreign allies joined the American side. Now, France was still pretty bitter over its defeat by Britain in the French and Indian War, in which France lost all its North American colonies. The French hoped to take revenge on the British by helping Britain's American colonies break free. In 1776, France began to give secret aid to the Americans. However, the French didn't want to lose to Britain a second time, so that's why they didn't publicly ally themselves with the United States until after the Americans had proved they could win battles. After hearing of the American victory at Saratoga, King Louis XVI of France recognized U.S. independence. In 1778, France signed 2 treaties of alliance with the United States. By doing this, France went to war with Britain. As part of its new alliance, France sent badly needed funds, supplies, and troops to America. In 1779, France persuaded its ally Spain to help the Americans. Spain was also Britain's rival. The Spanish governor of Louisiana, General Bernardo de Galvez, acted quickly. He captured the British strongholds of Natchez and Baton Rouge in the lower Mississippi Valley. From there, his small army went on to take Mobile in Alabama, and in 1781, Pensacola in western Florida. These victories prevented the British from attacking the United States from the southwest, which was very important. In addition, Britain had to keep thousands of troops fighting Galvez instead of fighting the Americans. However, like France, Spain's motives were not simply to help the United States. Galvez's victories helped extend Spain's empire in North America. By entering the war on America's side, France and Spain forced the British to fight a number of enemies on land and sea. The British had to spread their military resources over many fronts. For example, they were afraid they might have to fight the French in the West Indies, so they sent troops there. This prevented the British from concentrating their strength to defeat the inexperienced Americans. The Americans gained some of the military experience they needed from Europe. Several European military officers came to Washington's aid, including men from France, Poland, and the German states. The Marquis de Lafayette was a 19-year-old French nobleman who volunteered to serve in Washington's army. He wanted a military career and he believed in the American cause. He quickly gained Washington's confidence and was given the command of an army division. Lafayette won respect and love from his men by sharing their hardships. Called the soldier's friend, he used his own money to buy warm clothing for his ragged troops. Washington thought of him almost as a son. Lafayette fought in many battles and also persuaded the French king to send a 6,000-man army to America. He became a hero in both France and the United States. Later, he took part in France's own revolution. Along with Lafayette came the Baron de Kalb, a German officer who had served in the French army. He became one of Washington's generals and earned a reputation for bravery. In 1780, he received 11 wounds in the Battle of Camden, and he died. Another German, Baron von Steuben, helped turn the inexperienced Americans into a skilled fighting force. Washington asked him to train the army. In 1778, Steuben began by forming a model company of 100 men. Then he taught them how to move in lines and columns and how to handle weapons properly. Under Steuben's direction, the soldiers practiced making charges with bayonets or long steel knives that are attached to the ends of guns. Within a month, the troops were executing drills with speed and precision. Once the model company succeeded, the rest of the army adopted Steuben's methods. Now, help from Europeans came at a time when the Americans desperately needed it. In late 1777, Britain's General Howe forced Washington to retreat from Philadelphia, which we talked about in the last section. So beginning in the winter of 77 and 78, Washington and his army camped at Valley Forge in southeast Pennsylvania. On the march to Valley Forge, Washington's army was so short on supplies that many soldiers had only blankets to cover themselves. They also lacked shoes. The barefoot men left tracks of blood on the frozen ground as they marched. The soldiers' conditions did not improve at camp. Because of this, the name Valley Forge came to stand for the great hardships that Americans endured in the Revolutionary War. Over the winter, the soldiers at Valley Forge grew weak from not having enough food or warm clothing. Roughly a quarter of them ended up dying from malnutrition, exposure to the cold, or diseases such as smallpox and typhoid fever. Washington appealed to Congress to send the soldiers supplies, but it was slow in responding. Luckily, there were some citizens that privately came to the soldiers' aid. According to one story, on New Year's of 1778, a group of Philadelphia women drove 10 teams of oxen into camp. The oxen were pulling wagons loaded with supplies and 2,000 shirts. The women had the oxen killed to provide food for the men. Despite the hardships, Washington and his soldiers showed amazing endurance. Under such circumstances, soldiers often deserted or left military duty without intending to return. Some soldiers did desert, but Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks wrote that the Army stayed together because of, quote, love of our country, end quote. The men also stayed because of Washington. Private Samuel Downing declared that the soldiers loved him. They'd sell their lives for him. Now, out on the frontier, there were other Americans that also took on difficult challenges. In 1777, a 24-year-old frontiersman named George Rogers Clark walked into the office of Virginia Governor Patrick Henry. Clark said he had come to take part in defending the western frontier. He lived in Kentucky, which at the time was actually claimed by Virginia, and Clark wanted Virginia to defend that region against British soldiers and their Native American allies in what is now Indiana and Illinois. If a country is not worth protecting, he said, it's not worth claiming. Clark was pretty difficult to ignore in stature. He was about 6 feet tall, he had red hair, and he displayed a pretty dramatic personality. He persuaded Governor Henry that he was right. The governor told Clark to raise an army to capture British posts on the western frontier. In May of 1778, Clark and a group of frontiersmen began to travel up the Ohio River, and he recruited others on the way until he had a force of 175 to 200 men. They went by boat and later on foot to Kaskaskia, a British post in the Mississippi River, and they captured the fort without a fight. Then they moved east to take Fort Sackville at Vincennes in present-day Indiana. Earlier, a small force sent by Clark had taken Vincennes, but British forces under Henry Hamilton had recaptured it. Settlers called Hamilton the hair buyer because he supposedly paid rewards for American scalps. So determined to take Fort Sackville, Clark and his men set out for Vincennes from Kaskaskia in February of 1779. Hamilton wasn't expecting an attack because the rivers were overflowing their banks and the woods were flooded. Clark's men slogged through the miles of icy swamps and waded through chest-deep water, and they caught the British at Vincennes by surprise. When Hamilton and his troops tried to remain in the fort, Clark pretended to have a larger force than he really had. He also found a way to frighten the British into leaving. Clark and his men had captured several Native Americans who were allies of the British and had American scalps on their belts. Clark executed some of them in plain view of the fort, and he promised to do the same to Hamilton and his men if they didn't surrender immediately. They immediately gave up. So Clark's victory gave the Americans a hold on the vast region between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. This area was more than half the total size of the original 13 states. However, Fort Detroit on Lake Erie remained in the hands of the British. Now the war expanded not only to the frontier but also to the sea. By 1777, Britain had about 100 warships off the American coast. This allowed Britain to control the Atlantic trade routes. There was no way the Americans could defeat the powerful British Navy. But American privateers attacked British merchant ships. A privateer is a privately owned ship that a wartime government gives permission to attack an enemy's merchant ships. After capturing a British merchant ship, the crew of a privateer sold its cargo and shared the money. As a result, a desire for profit as well as patriotism motivated privateers. The states and Congress commissioned more than 1,000 privateers to prey on the British. During the war, they captured hundreds of British ships, and this greatly disrupted trade, which caused British merchants to call for the war to end. Many men answered the privateers' calls for volunteers. Among them was a 14-year-old named James Forten, who was the son of a free African-American sailmaker. In 1780, Fortin signed up to sail on the Royal Louis to earn money for his family after his father died. When a British ship captured his ship in 1781, the British offered Fortin a free trip to England. Reportedly, Fortin refused, saying he would never betray his country. Released from a British prison after the war, Fortin walked barefoot from New York to his home in Philadelphia, and he later became famous for his efforts to end slavery. Now, though outnumbered, the Continental Navy scored several victories against the British. An officer named John Paul Jones won the most famous sea battle. In 1779, Jones became the commander of a ship named Bonhomme Richard. With 4 other ships, he patrolled the English coast. In September, Jones's vessels approached a convoy in which 2 British warships were guarding a number of supply ships. Jones closed in on the Sarah P., the larger of the 2 warships. At one point, the Bonhomme Richard ran the better armed British vessel, and as the 2 ships locked together, the confident British captain demanded that Jones surrender. In words that have become a famous U.S. Navy slogan, Jones replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." The 2 warships were so close together that the muzzles of their guns almost touched. They blasted away, each seriously damaging the other. On the shore, crowds of Britons gathered under a full moon to watch the fighting. After a fierce 3.5-hour battle, the main mast of the Sarah P. cracked and fell. The ship's captain then surrendered. The Bonhomme Richard was so full of holes that it eventually sank, so Jones and his crew had to sail away in the Sarah P. So Jones's success against the best navy in the world angered the British and inspired the Americans. Even so, the Americans knew that the war had to be won on land. And in Section 3, we're going to discuss the major land battles in the closing years of the war.